his keynote talk for the first talk of this session. And thanks everyone for joining. So we are going to start the first session of the day 2 event of this UK Indian OpenFOAM Symposium. Professor Roy.
So, you have to mute your mic.
So in the field of thermofluids, Professor Suman Chakraborty probably does not need any introduction. He is one of the leading experts in computational fluid dynamics, microfluidics, and his present research interest also includes healthcare for in an affordable manner for wider population range, and he has worked in almost all areas of thermofluids, has a very vast experience in different aspects, and worked in, as we are discussing, in open source and in-house course. He has expertised over all different aspects, and he's published more than 1,000 papers in different journals and reputed conferences, authored a number of textbooks also. He's recipient of Infosys Award and Santi Sarup Bhatnagar Award, and many other laurels are there in his bag. So I'll request Professor Chakraborty to please share his screen and start the discussion.
Thanks very much, Chandan and Somnath, and it's definitely an honor, and the way you are presenting my profile is something. Okay, I have not written 1,000 papers, but it's all nice to.
Journals, considering journals and conferences.
Maybe I am that also may not add up to that. I do not know, but I will not. Sort of, it's something just as a gesture, but I appreciate your sort of sentiment and putting my contribution up. And let me first share my slides, which is always the most sort of concerning part. After that, I will enter into the talk straight away. Is something visible? Then I will make it full screen.
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay. So, this is a talk which is not really based on one particular aspect of CFD. And, once this proposition was put forward as a talk on a related theme, I thought that, what I would say. But, I could realize that something in the context of an OpenFOAM based, or rather in general open source CFD software based approach that perhaps is going to be discussed in this particular forum in a focused manner, to what I realized as what was the state of the art, what people used to do in terms of CFD in my own student life, which dates more than 20 years back. This is something which I thought that I would like to share. So my first introduction to a very formal course of CFD was with Professor Pradeep Datta at IISc Bangalore, when he was new faculty, and I was, of course, a master student. And at that point of time, why I'm bringing that into perspective, because at that point of time, be a commercial software or be a open source software, these were not something which were parts and parcels of academic CFD work. I mean, I'm sure industry was using whatever software tools were available to the best possible extent, considering that era. But that was not the academic practice. So the academic practice at that point of time, and I will talk about how it has helped to move ahead the Indian journey of the CFD over the past several years. And perhaps the shift in the academic journey, which has not been so good for the development of CFD over those years, over the subsequent years. Now at that point of time, we my first point is that we did not take CFD as a black box tool, and it was so because in most of the cases, and here I find several other people who have gone through that period and similar period in their own student lives, where any development of CFD in terms of algorithm, method, and use was primarily based on a in-house code. It might not be written by a single person, but it is from a group, and how things were developed in that. But I would come into a bit of a more historically how things were shaping up and how things were being developed at that point of time, be in India, be elsewhere. And I would not restrict myself to India, because none of us have worked on these topics fully within India. We have worked at different places on different topics and collaborating with different people. Many of them are not from India, so it doesn't sort of restrict anything to India. But overall, what I see, maybe as an academician who have made his professional career in India. So molecular. So if we see at the end in CFD, we are trying to numerically predict certain fluid flow behavior, which we are not analytically able to do, and experimentally also it may not be feasible. So once we are trying to do that, our main emphasis is to see that how we can mathematically represent the flow behavior, and how we can physically relate that with what kind of model that we are looking for. So fundamentally any system will have molecules, and molecules will have their further divisions, and therefore it is quite logical from a statistical mechanics point of view that direction of understanding the physical problem through either directly simulating what is happening on the molecular level, or statistically representing an ensemble of molecules, and that is how different directions evolved. And in the late 90s, the lattice-Boltzmann model, it became very popular in a way that it tried to act as a good bridge between whatever molecular dynamics could do, and whatever a statistical maybe a kinetic Boltzmann approach could do, by considering their own limitations, but their scientific merits. Independently one could arrive at that. But having said that, all the everybody in CFD has learned the first course of CFD by relating that with Navier-Stokes equation. No matter in whatever area they are working now. So, and people could realize that in certain limits of expansion, these by using, for example, the Chapman and Skog expansion, one could recover in some order, maybe 0th order the Euler equation, the first order Navier-Stokes, etc. So in that way, one this particular approach was sort of a good fundamental basis, because it's not a question of like CFD as a broad umbrella. The question is that what we are going to do with the CFD, what scale we are going to capture, what is the physics that we are going to capture. So in that way, two different directions clearly emerged. One is molecular, another is continuum model. And today what we normally discuss as CFD is mostly continuum model. But nowadays, because there is a lot of overlap and interest in understanding physics at different scales, and this interest has progressed because of several reasons. One is that there have been significant developments in technology to actually work on those scales, not just conceptually, but by experiments. And secondly, there even it has come to design. And secondly, that even in fully continuum based consideration, there are situations where one has to look for physics or scale which is different from continuum. May not be for the entire domain, but a part of the domain or a part of the analysis. So that is where one has to bring in some aspects of the molecular modeling. Now, the way in which I saw our CFD evolving is that we first saw the continuum based modeling, and then it's just the opposite to what happened historically. That is what I want to emphasize. And then the molecular aspects of modeling came more and more into what I would say as complementary to the traditional CFD. And the reason of this inverse thing happening in the computational world is that everybody had a clear understanding that these molecular or statistical models were powerful and important, but people did not have the computational resources to actually work on this. And with the advancement of high performance computing facilities, things came up. Now this is in a bit of a light note. As a teacher, sometimes as a distractor, I try to put these kinds of notes. That on one hand you have a molecular aspect of looking into a problem, and on another hand you have a continuum aspect of looking into a problem. And the CFD at some point of time, what I saw maybe in the mid 2000s or early 2000s, the research approach clearly tried to merge these. Whether any single open source software is able to solve that or not is an open issue and debate, and that can be discussed as a part of a conference like this. But I'm just trying to give you that where is the fallacy and where is the challenge. So let us imagine that we have a university where we have two extreme types of students. One, say in a scale of 3, we say genius or super intellectual, 3 out of 3. Very rare, but you can get maybe at some point of time. And the other, also not very common, but more common than this one, that's intellect level of 1. Perhaps intellect level of 2 is what people would get the most. Now, but how extreme figures can disturb the statistics, I'm just showing to highlight that, and that is where there is a lot of things that is needed to bridge the gap between the statistics and traditional CFD, and how data science currently is taking care of some aspects of hidden physics in the CFD. So if you see, let us say that there is a teacher who has taught 1 semester course with 1 student. Currently, we are perhaps no institute will allow such as 1 student, 1 subject, but hypothetically, let us assume that it is there. And it's the average intellect that the teacher is getting in the class is 3, because only 1, and that is exceptional. In the second semester, the teacher is not that lucky. It's a larger class, and everybody is of that 1 intellect, and average is 1. In the third semester, it's a bit of a mix. So 2 students, 1 grade 3, and another below par, that is 1. And therefore, now if you want to see what is the average intellect that the teacher has taught over these 3 semesters. So 16 students, if you just multiply by their weight, that is there. And then if you want to find out that what is now the average intellect, that the teacher has handled. So one way is that averaging over the 3 semesters, which are like sort of individual, you can say ensembles. So 3 plus 1 plus 2 divided by 3, that is 2. But another approach would be that why should we do that? We should make a cumulative, or you can say weighted average, and it is 20 divided by 16 cases, so 1.25. So this just shows that there is a significant difference when there is a correlation between the class size and the quality of students in the class. I mean, many times we nowadays have to do certain statistical sort of calculations at the end of or at the beginning of what we are doing for the CFD. And this is where I found that when these two approaches were merging, that this is a critical question, and it doesn't have a good answer, although we have good tools to work on those in open source or maybe in a closed software. That how should one measure the local fluid velocity from particle velocities? And here we have to imagine that there is nothing called as a particle so far. It is like a concept of a fictitious fluid particle, which is statistically carrying the information, local information, different from a continuum. And locally, it is like we can say that the Eulerian and Lagrangian approach is merging. So wherever this particle is existing, and if it is neutrally buoyant, then its motion is dictating that what would be the Eulerian field at that particular point at that instant of time. So the question is, one could have a center of mass velocity within a cell. Now I am coming to that, sort of a CFD language, cell or computational volume or element, whatever you call, an average particle velocity. And, one has to figure out a way that not just theoretically, we just do the sampling correctly so that, they tend to converge, to the same data at the end. So if that is done carefully, I think that one of the good approaches would be that we can have an interchangeable approach of solving a problem conceptually. I mean, one can use molecular, continuum, statistical, etc. Now, having said that, when we write a standard CFD code, and why I am emphasizing this is because we have been brought up in an era where we had to work on our own codes, and in that era there was neither any open source code to work with or not any commercial software which was a part of our research. I mean, commercial software was there, but one could use those for solving other problems, but not for our own research problem. So what I could realize is that whatever the CFD is trying to do conceptually, it could be heat transfer, mass transfer, momentum transfer, whatever. It is trying to actually play a balance. That means there is a unit. If we are talking about an analytical solution, the unit is differentially small. We call dx, dy, dz, all tending to 0. But when it is a finite sized computational cell, we are taking those delta x, delta y, etc., which are finite. They may be small, but they are finite. And that is the basic difference, because number crunching we cannot do with limitingly small, but we have to do with finite things. So if we write a balance of fluxes, whatever is coming in and whatever is going out, and write that in a form of a partial differential equation, we normally arrive at a general conservative equation where this phi is some variable. It could be velocity, temperature, concentration, and even in other multi-physics fields where it is not fluid mechanics but maybe electrical or magnetic, whatever, you can bring in equations which template like this. So my way of looking into CFD is that there is a whole lot of practical consideration in going in different directions of CFD. But if we go through this differential equation route, the single motto is to have an approximate numerical solution of the governing differential equation. That is the single motto. So then the question is, let us say you have this red line, which is that continuous solution, which we do not have. So how can we approximate this with solution at discrete points where we have the solution, and possibly play up with some interpolation or statistics or whatever to reconstruct to the extent possible closest to this red line. That is what is the whole idea. So because we are not able to analytically solve, or rather we are not interested to analytically solve because of several reasons, maybe the complex geometry, non-linearity, boundary conditions, etc. So we divide the domain into subdomains, which could be elements, control volumes, cells, or whatever name we can give. And each of these points, or it might have multiple degrees of freedom. Each of those degrees of freedom would give rise to one algebraic equation at the end. In that way, you could have a coupled or decoupled, but a system of algebraic equations. And then at the end, the job is to basically solve those equations. Now, keeping that in view, with that broad view, still different methods people have been trying over the years, and the research community has duly acknowledged that, like either the mesh-based method or the meshless methods, they have their advantages, disadvantages. So overall, you have the governing equations, you discretize, you get a system of algebraic equations. Maybe you are using a matrix solver, or any other form of solver, and then you get an approximate solution. So most of the CFD codes that we have been working with over the years, either in-house or commercial or open source, have tried to broadly follow this. That means get at the end the differential equations converted to algebraic equations and use a solver. And in that way, the issues that cropped up, that have been cropping up, it is independent of what is the software that we are using, that we are having an objective of getting a reasonably accurate solution at minimum cost, and with this cost is computational cost, but not at any cost. That means we are of course trying to have some checks and balances in terms of the numerical accuracy, stability, numerical efficiency, validation, reliability and flexibility, and of course in the modern day computer vision has come in a big way, so visualization. Now all these are very important parts and parcels of what we are doing, and why I am emphasizing all these is with the so much availability of different CFD tools. What I find is that in many cases the current generation is sometimes sort of overlooking into the tools and overlooking into these aspects and getting into that black box mode as early as possible. So in the time when this CFD code got into that open source paradigm and many open source software that has come, I believe that most of those early developers were from the tradition in which people like us have grown up in the CFD, where we have learned that a CFD will have a preprocessor, solver and post-processor, and the open source things, they have tried to make the preprocessor and post-processor friendly to the extent possible and generalized to the extent possible, that a common user can approach them in a much better manner that our in-house codes can do. I have worked with many in-house codes developed by maybe starting from some developed by my seniors and maybe by me as a first developer, and maybe that passed on to some of my students who have subsequently developed. Now what I find is that one of the great challenges is that it's something like I have to read the story as a developer, and anybody else will then be able to follow and use it, which is not so good for an open source thing. If there is a good documentation, and that's I think a very good spirit that has developed, that the documentation should be so good that the pre-processing and post-processing is something where people have good access, and that is very good because then people will have at least an idea of what is going on instead of using it as a black box button pressing exercise. Now CFD in the last 5 to 10 years has evolved into also some different directions where a lot of emphasis come to multi-phase CFD. Multi-phase flow has been existing for a very long time, and people have been solving such problems. But I will give you certain context where this has taken a different turn, and the different turn, of course, I'm not reading out these slides because everybody in CFD is familiar, but you have the moving mesh and the fixed mesh or a fixed grid method, and these methods have their own advantages and disadvantages, and people have started using certain methods which have well-known computational advantage. For example, the boundary element method. So one of the great advantages is that you are able to convert your 3D problem to a 2D problem by sort of working on the surface of a volume, where your main emphasis is looking into the equations on the surface. But having said that, not that that has all the advantages. Reduction of dimensionality is one of the advantages, but you have other several other limitations, like it's still very difficult to compute large deformations of the interface, and this may cause mesh entanglement, etc. So some of the traditional methods work better there because they require no special treatment to simulate topological changes. It's the phase field method, which very commonly we use in our lab. It is very good in that way because it merges the basic physics and thermodynamics, and it can easily merge multi-physics into the core of CFD, and that is quite good because it uses a free energy based approach, which is more of a statistical or thermodynamic approach, and that is valid even for our basic fluid mechanics conservation laws. Having said that, such they have their own computational challenges, and they also have lots of free parameters, and those free parameters are not quite easy to set in a CFD solution. So over the past 5 years or so, and our research group has also concentrated more into that, that CFD from fluid to life. That means, by looking into engineering flows, how can we extrapolate that to understand the living systems and biological systems and fluid flows therein. So I'm giving a classical example where from a droplet, how we can sort of progress to understanding a vesicle, which is a membrane, you can say filled with water. You can imagine as a, for someone who is not familiar with this, like a balloon filled with water. But that doesn't have the living elements. You get into a cell, which is a sort of it is a structural and functional unit of life, and it has its own living aspects. So there are lots of CFD tools which look into the cellular dynamics. You have, for example, the hybrid lattice Boltzmann and immerse boundary based methods working on cells in a fluidic system. But the challenge remains, and that is where the CFD is perhaps going to move into, be it an open source, and I think open source will help a lot in that, because you can put into a bit more physics and mathematics into that. That where is the element of life? When we model a cell, we put mechanical properties, maybe the membrane properties, the fluid properties, etc. But a balloon filled with water is very different from the living activities of a cell. You have mitochondria, cytoplasm, you have the nucleic acids. They do so many things, and many of those things are not well understood. So how do we bring that into the CFD? Perhaps energetics or free energy based consideration will help, but there is no straightforward way of doing that. And in many cases, we also require the hybrid continuum molecular approach. And that is where perhaps what is happening at the molecular level has to get embedded. So whatever open source software now people are using, for example, in CFD, people are very strongly using OpenFOAM, and it's a very nice object-oriented way of looking into it. In the molecular field, people are using LAMPS, GROMACS, etc., which are originally molecular dynamics tools, but particle-based models, and people can use it even for non-molecular phenomena. Now, one of the I think emerging directions in which people can go is how to combine these open source tools to form a single hybrid continuum connected open source tool. This is an open question. So some research issues like multi-scale, multi-physics hybrid approach, where you have the stochastic implementation, particle fluid coupling, fluid structure interactions are already there, but over small scales where these molecular aspects have to be embedded. And of course, with high performance computing and parallelization, getting more and more into the access of people who are doing CFD implementation. These have been there, but not so much into access of researchers. How can we make use of all of them to build up a dream open source element which can address many of these issues, but it is not just crunching numbers, but also solving, you can say, mysteries or hidden physics. Data science is there, but we have to imagine that data science also will require huge and diverse set of data. So where from will it come? So you require a good physics based backbone, and then you can generate data out of that, and then you can do more statistics out of that, and that will be more meaningful. And I will end up with the last slide. This is a sort of my experience that I had, as I told, 20 years back, the student life, to my present day. I can remember, one of my classes, early classes, when the teacher, I not name the teacher, but the teacher, we were discussing about CFD, and in those days, colorful plots were not, very common to get, because we used to get prints for our reports, etc., and every color print would cost. And as a student, our scholarships in those days were not much. Having said that, CFD was already known by that time as colorful fluid dynamics, or in companies, people would say color for directors. That means nice colorful images with sort of B streamlines, B different contours, and it would be so fascinating that sometimes we will not look into that. It's just like a modern smartwatch. So fascinating, we never ask a question whether it is giving the right blood pressure or whatever data it is giving. So quality of a simulation is inversely proportional to the amount of color employed in representing the same. Remember, it was told more than 20 years back. Now, if we tell something to maybe our students will throw stones at us. because now everything is color and color doesn't cost much. But it tells some sort of philosophy. In a open source, or you can say commercial as such package, be sure about the boundary conditions before certain button clicking, inlet outlet wall in the GUI. Very important, because I have seen people giving outflow boundary condition without understanding what is outflow. Is it fully developed flow? What it is doing? So in that way, sometimes wrong boundary conditions are given. So are we sure that our code is implementing the physics that we are looking for? In most of the times, a casual analyzer will be a part of a garbage in, garbage out exercise. It is now having a more danger because more tools are available. In our times, we were very, very keen to use such black box things. No way we are different from modern generation students, but we did not have much of access. So we tried to develop our own things. For physically wrong solutions, therefore, don't blame a commercial or restricted source on open source code. It's our responsibility to see what is there. And many things we learn in theory will not work in practice. Very important, as we have learned, that a mesh refinement need not always yield a better solution, because mesh refinement can lead to deal with small numbers, and there could be issues with small numbers, rather than it's not a pen and paper stability convergence analysis. And many times, because the open source users, or we go for validation, and this is something which I always remember, that if a numerical solution exactly matches with experiment, there is something wrong either with the experiment or with the numerical solution. It is normally not likely to match. And there are several such experiences that we can all share, and we can try to build up a journey where the next gen CFD will be definitely, it's going to be the open source, which is going to stand out. But we have to be careful in sort of getting into that, where the open source nature is not something that it is going to distract us from some of these bounding principles that hold the philosophy of CFD together. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. I think this was such an excellent overview of the CFD from our student days, and to link it your student days is a multiple generations of development of CFD. And I mean, I would completely resonate with one of the comments that we have got, that someone has written that I have followed your NPTEL lecture series of CFD, and that's actually true for me as well. I mean, besides, I would like to mention it that besides numerous accolades in research, I think the teaching impact of Professor Suman Chakraborty is very, very well known. And I mean, when I studied in my undergrad, I actually watched your CFD lectures and fluid mechanics lectures, and thank you for that.
Thanks very much, because it gives a great feeling, because as a teacher, it is very important for me to see that whatever I could realize as some learning from my part, I can percolate onto younger generations. And all of you, like you are very, very established, as an all of you are, of course, early career academicians, much younger than me, but you are quite established. So not several of you. And when I see the journey, I realize that whatever that could come through this NPTEL teaching, and if you could connect, many of you may have seen my lecture. This is all what I wanted to resonate. That use whatever tools or software that you have, but please use your fundamentals. Please do not sacrifice your fundamentals at the interest of a tool that you have, but you have absolutely zero background. Maybe you do not know the first principle derivation of everything. It is impossible, because we are trained as engineers. We cannot have the first principle based understanding of everything like a physicist will have. Having said that, we should not also have complete ignorance, and there should be a balance.
Yes, I think that's where these open source tools can play a role, because it has a subtle difference between commercial codes, because where we can't see the code and the governing equation, how we are discretizing it. But that is where the discussion is happening in this conference, that if we want to go for more and more complex multi-physics problem, as you said, by combining molecular level and the continuum approach together, should we always start with the Navier-Stokes equation for the learning? Of course, yes. But when we keep developing, probably we should know how to solve a Navier-Stokes equation and then keep adding complexities through
Exactly.
the collaborative approach of the community. So thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here. I think it's
So it's my pleasure, and no, thanks very much. I will not be able to attend the full thing, but I'm just requesting you to. Are you going to have a recording of most of the lectures or no?
yes, yes. We will upload it, and before
Yes,
you
yes,
leave, I
please.
think we
Yes.
yeah
Yes,
we
please.
have some questions in the chat box.
Yes.
Quickly, we'll take one or two.
Mhm.
So the first question I can see here is that if you were an undergrad student now, what steps would you take to propel yourself towards deep knowledge in CFD and fluid mechanics in general?
Okay, okay. It's a very good question, because this is what many of us forget. We always blame our next generation that they are working only on smartphones. But my question would be that had these smartphones been available at a time when we grew up, I do not know what more nuisance we would have done. Possibly more nuisance than these people are doing. So the question is that the answer should be, I think, based on what is currently available as a tool. And so what is currently available as a tool are, which is accessible to everybody, is a set of open source software, and maybe some in-house, depending on maybe the undergraduate student is also associated with a lab where they have their open in-house things. So that's one thing. I would suggest that you first ignore that whatever is available with you, and you first develop certain basics. That means what we are trying to do in CFD is, either molecular or continuum, we are trying to solve a system of equations numerically. So try to get a bit of familiarity with numerical methods of maybe solving algebraic equations, systems of equations, or maybe individual equations. Preferably first linear, but even non-linear is okay. So get a bit of handle on understanding the numerical analysis of solving algebraic equations. I think this is an independent handle, and it is required for almost everything that we do in CFD as a concept. Why it is very important is because each of these methods have certain pros and cons which dictate the nature of the solution. The stability, the convergence, so many things. The second thing would be to realize, to get into, that what we are going to do as a CFD analyst as a, you can say, even if you are not looking into it from a traditional viewpoint. And what I would imagine that almost everybody here, is interested to use CFD for solving a physical problem rather than developing altogether a new method. It may be a hybrid method that people may be interested to develop, but not altogether a new method. So then it is very important to learn what is Navier-Stokes equation, where from it comes, a general conservative way of looking into the CFD, and what is the nature of the PDE, and then how to discretize that PDE in different methods. May not be all methods, but at least finite volume, finite element, finite difference, the basic discretization, and then how that discretization leads to algebraic equations. And once this background knowledge is ready, then I think the student is free to use whatever open source, in-house, or even a commercial software to work on certain basic problems. And at undergraduate level, I would emphasize a lot to work on basic problems like pipe flow, channel flow, some standard problems, because these are some problems with which they can relate with whatever is learned in even the core fluid mechanics, which is not a computational subject in a different channel. I mean, many people learn a core fluid mechanics not for doing CFD, but for understanding the subject. Maybe people become experimentalists also after that. So how that can be related to solving a CFD problem, because that gives a lot of insight. Like solving a pipe flow problem, I can remember that one of my mentors, Professor Franz Durst, who is now 80 plus, when I was a Humboldt fellow with him, he gave a talk that that was maybe 15 years back. That have we understood everything about pipe flows? So we take pipe flows, channel flows as if like these are nothing, and but so many insights of that can come up, and those insights will not necessarily come up by an analytical solution, because those are restricted. You cannot do beyond something. So many of those things can be tried, and using that one can get a good handle in sort of nurturing with a CFD code, be it open source, be it commercial, etc. And I think then the student can shoot off to a particular direction depending on interest and everything. But I think this is the basic background that all students can do.
Sure. I think for the interest of time, we should move forward. I thank you again, Professor Chakraborty, for joining us. And we will share this recorded lecture eventually in YouTube channel of CCST.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will actually now go for our next session of talks, which are mostly by the PhD scholars in UK and India.